But now we want to move on to a related point, and that is the rise of this right-wing opposition to things like the war in Ukraine, and what that really means, and how it should be viewed by others who maybe are certainly opposed to this NATO proxy war, but are not right-wingers. Nonetheless, we are very, very happy to be joined here on the show once again by Amanda Yee, who's an editor at liberationnews.org, also hosts the podcast Radio Free Amanda. Amanda, as always, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me on again.
Well, it's great to have you on, and you just wrote an important article on Liberation News about this exact issue, the resurgence of America First isolationism, the far right's opposition to NATO, and the Ukraine war. There's a lot I want to get into here because it was an important article. Again, you can find it at liberationnews.org. But, first and foremost, I was hoping you could actually give some context to the phrase America First, which I think you laid out has a long and somewhat sinister history, but it's so exclusively focused, I think, contemporarily on the Trump movement. Some of that, prehistory, which I think is relevant to everything else, gets lost.
Yeah, so we kind of associate America First right now with this resurging political tendency that's happening within the Republican Party. And it's won over a debate of current foreign policy. And within the party right now, you have the ones who subscribe to a more traditional neoconservative hawkishness that's oriented around American military domination around the globe. And that's been kind of standard orthodoxy for the past 4 decades since Ronald Reagan, right? But with the rise of Trump in 2016, it's carried with it a resurgence of what's known as America First isolationism. And it's this ideology that's subscribed to by Trump himself and people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Josh Hawley, Lauren Boebert, Matt Gaetz, those people, right? And this ideology is characterized by anti-foreign intervention, but also high trade tariffs on imports, as well as a program of really vicious pro-austerity and elimination of the welfare state, cuts to public spending, tax cuts for the wealthy, and a really racist anti-immigration policy. And it's not something new. It kind of came into being in the beginning of the last century. And it's always historically carried with it this semi-fascist, if not overtly fascist political character to it. And in fact, in the 1920s, the KKK even adopted America First as its slogan, right? And so with the Russian special military operation in Ukraine, we've seen this faction of the party really latch onto growing popular discontent over the role of NATO and over US involvement in the Ukraine war. And it's this ideological trend that has recently reemerged under Trump, but it's not actually new. And it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's actually part of a longer historical trend within the Republican Party. The phrase America First was actually used by Woodrow Wilson back in 1916 during his re-election campaign. And he ran under the campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war." And that was his promise not to enter World War I, the First World War. But once reelected, he sort of backed out of that promise and officially entered the war. And even though Wilson was a Democrat, America First, this ideology, this kind of anti-interventionist doctrine really started to pick up steam. And it developed into the predominant ideology among the Republican Party. And it really reached its peak in the run-up to World War II. In the run-up to World War II, there was an America First committee that was formed, and it had about 800,000 members across the country. And it led the anti-war movement, it led the opposition to U.S. entry into World War II. And it was really led by the right wing. They thought the war was Europe's own problem to solve and that the U.S. shouldn't be spending money on what they saw as Europe's defense. And within this America First committee, there were a lot of Nazi sympathizers, anti-Semitic elements. And the spokesperson for this party was Charles Lindbergh. and he's like kind of a famous Nazi sympathizer, right? He is quoted to have said in his speech that Jewish people were to blame for pushing the US into a war that wasn't in its national interest. And he had really far right views on immigration. In a Reader's Digest column in 1939, he said that Americans' inheritance of European blood was their most priceless possession, and that it needed to be guarded against dilution by foreign races. So, over the decades, this kind of America First ideology became the standard orthodoxy of the Republican Party for decades until it was like eventually displaced by the Cold War. And the Cold War was what really led to this political realignment within the Republican Party towards more of a neoconservative, hawkish stance, which is how we come to associate it with now, right? But it kind of, it would rear its head from time to time. Like Pat Buchanan was an America First isolationist. He ran 3 times for president between 1992 and 2000 under an America First policy platform. But it has really been making a comeback under Trump, especially with this growing discontent we see over the billions of military aid that we're sending to Ukraine every few months, right? Trump has been critical of NATO, and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Josh Hawley have really been vocal about their opposition to US involvement in this war. So for us within the anti-war movement who recognize like the imperialist nature of the US NATO alliance and the role that it's played in driving and sustaining this war, there has been a question among the left and like among the left adjacent of whether we should align ourselves with this America First movement. But it's really not the answer. This kind of America First program, if you look at the rest of the policies that they advocate, it's really a wedge used to divide workers domestically, and it shifts a lot of the blame of declining the declining US economy to those across the border. And it's this tendency that carries with it like kind of a fascist political character.
And I want you to elaborate on that a bit because it's so important. I mean, there's the anti-immigrant aspect of this. There's also like the fact that this tendency of these right wingers like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Josh Hawley, who are maybe critical of NATO and funding the war in Ukraine, want to take those resources and put them towards escalating with China, which they're pretty explicit about. So I guess like, let me play devil's advocate here, right? Because you do have people arguing, no, like in a situation like what's happening in Ukraine, it's so serious. There's the threat of nuclear war. Like we should be aligning with anybody in any sort of position of power, as well as those who support them, who want to put a stop to it. And we deal with the other stuff later, right? That's the argument you hear. So how do you respond to that argument?
Well, I would say that's a really short-sighted and dangerous strategy, right? What this new generation of America First isolationists have in common with previous generations is that they see NATO and the Ukraine war, or any war in Europe, as like a massive US wealth transfer to Europe. And they oppose it on the basis that we're spending our money on Europe's military defense when they should be spending their own money on it. So I think this is where people get a little bit tripped up. The America First isolationists are not against military spending. They're only against military spending toward what they see as fighting Europe's wars for them. So they don't see Russia as a direct threat. And they think the war in Ukraine is actually draining resources from what our real enemy is, which is China and the Communist Party of China. And so if you read their policy platforms, they see China as a direct threat to Western civilization and that we should be prepared to confront China politically and militarily. And this is why like people arguing for any kind of anti-war alliance with these people are playing a really dangerous game, right? Because a military confrontation with China would be disastrous. But, even now, it's people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Josh Hawley who have really helped to inflame this ongoing McCarthyism and red scaremongering over China, right? So like during the ridiculous spy spy balloon incident earlier this year, Greene criticized Biden's response as not decisive enough, and she accused him of selling out to China. And at a fundraiser in Idaho, she told her audience that, the Chinese spy balloon, it could have carried with it a bioweapon or a nuclear bomb. And so during the pandemic, when anti-Asian harassment and assaults were on the rise, she's been quoted as saying that if it were up to her, she would kick out every Chinese citizen in the U.S. if she could. And people, Holly, who really inflamed this discourse around the supposed Chinese spy base in Cuba when news broke of it a few weeks ago. And he was quoted as saying, I'm sure we'll soon be voting on yet another supplemental aid package to Ukraine, but China is literally in our backyard right now talking about this supposed spy base in Cuba. And the reason why this is so dangerous is that because we've been seeing these heightened attacks against Asian Americans during COVID, but also we're seeing a lot of McCarthyist and Red Scare tactics used against Asian American activists by the state right now who are vocally opposing the new Cold War on China, right? Trump in 2020, he signed an executive order to expel thousands of Chinese university students for purported ties to the People's Liberation Army, even though they had ties to civilian universities and they were only provided scholarships by the PLA. And over the past few years, we've been seeing more Chinese students and scientists and engineers being indicted over the Foreign Agent Registration Act, or FARA. Like most recently in Boston, a hotel worker and Chinese American activist named Henry Liang was indicted under FARA. And he is accused of working as a spy for the CPC, but his only crime has been advocating for peaceful relations between China and the US and peaceful reunification between Taiwan and the mainland of China, right? So these far-right isolationists aren't anti-war at all. They're escalating this Cold War rhetoric on China, which has far-reaching consequences for Chinese people today in the US. And their ultimate endgame is they really want to pivot from this proxy war in Ukraine to a full military confrontation with China, which again would be disastrous.
It certainly would. Just staring down the barrel of one nuclear war to staring down the barrel of another. Anyway, I won't editorialize too much because you lay it out quite well in your article on liberationnews.org, The Resurgence of America First Isolationism, the far right's opposition to NATO and the Ukraine war. Amanda Yee, as always, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on Breakthrough News.
Thanks a lot.